You're good.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. My name is Louise Coma. I'm a plant physiologist with the Water Management and Systems Research Unit in Fort Collins. Kyle Douglas-Mankin is an agricultural engineer and hydrologist with the same unit, and we'll be talking to you a little bit today about sorghum. So, and some of the research that our unit has been doing with sorghum. So, a big focus of our work is adapting irrigated cropping systems to water scarcity. So we're developing options for growers when they don't have enough water to fully irrigate their farm with corn. We've explored various strategies to apply deficit irrigation so that corn water deficits don't negatively impact yield. So we've been able to hold back 17% of full irrigation during the late vegetative stage prior to VT with no yield impacts. And this may actually have additional benefits for protecting corn against end of year shortfalls. But to implement the strategic deficit irrigation, growers need to be able to control the timing of their irrigation. And this isn't a viable option necessarily for all growers. Not all growers are able to have this control. Many are reliant on the ditch schedule or need to run pivots continually to keep up with crop water needs. Another way to handle farm water shortfalls is to switch all or part of the farm to an alternative crop that uses less water. So today we'll be talking mostly about sorghum, but introducing a modeling project that is set up for many alternative crops with this goal of exploring crop choices for farms across the region. Currently, we're modeling historic weather data, but we do hope in the future to be able to run simulations with forecasted weather data so that this model can also be used to assist grower decision-making in the springtime. Depending on what the season might look like. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The research that most of the data that we'll be showing you and simulations that we'll be showing you are from data taken on our limited irrigation farm. So this irrigation farm has been run since about 2008. We set it up. It's about a 40-acre farm in Greeley, Colorado, where we have about 14 inches of annual precip. This site has pretty sandy loam soil. We have different types of irrigation available at the farm for research. But you see here in this picture, we have several large fields that are plumbed so that we can randomize treatments and get really good irrigation control. So the farm is very well set up to run large field experiments with controlled water treatments. We've worked with many different crops at the farm. Some water production functions that we've gotten from some of those experiments are here on this graph. We're looking at yield on the y-axis mapped against the annual water use by that crop from planting to maturity. And cutting back on the water applied, we can develop these water production functions to look at productivity with different amounts of water available. So we have corn in black, we have sunflower in gray, and sorghum here in white. Many people probably remember that in 2012 was an extremely hot, dry year. Both crops that we were running that year, the sunflower as well as the corn, were using about 4 inches more water, but we still had really good yields. But that exceptionally hot, dry year you can see here. Really interestingly, I think this illustrates nicely that that corn is most certainly the top choice for producers in the area, and you can see why. It does use more water, but it has much higher yields for that water used. Sunflower, the yields from sunflower here may be a little bit deceiving because, of course, this is an oil sunflower. It's a mid-oleic sunflower hybrid. So the value in the sunflower crop is, of course, in the oil, not just the bulk production. Strikingly here, when we look at the sorghum water production function in the same graph as the corn water production function, we see that sorghum really is a continuation of the water production function of corn. And with the seed costs of corn and the high inputs needed, you see very quickly why if you can't nearly full irrigate.
Did she got frozen?
Yeah, she's frozen on my computer.
Kyle, do you want to?
Let's give her just.
I can send her an email.
Let's just give her a few seconds. She'll probably maybe try to get back in.
Okay.
But we won't. Let's not wait more than like a minute. There we go.
She's back.
Hi. I'm sorry about that. I lost connection. I will reshare the screen. Let's see. So I think we were talking about the fact that sorghum is a continuation of the water production function of corn, and that if you start having water shortages such that you can't be near the top of this water production function for corn, then with the high input costs of the high seed and fertilizer and other input costs for corn, that you can see where it starts being more preferable to switch to a different crop. So, and sorghum is one that's a natural fit for many maize producers, many corn producers. So next slide is looking at water production functions across the region. So we have data here from Garden City, Kansas, Akron, Colorado. The Garden City, Kansas data set, you see that maximum yield is a little bit higher than what we get both in Akron and in Greeley. Maximum yields here are about 10,000 hectares per 10,000 kilograms per hectare, about 150 bushels per acre, whereas in Colorado, in Akron and Greeley, our top yields are closer to 150 bushel per acre, 120 bushel per acre. But although we're perhaps on the edge of the range of sorghum here in Greeley, we can, with this short season sorghum variety, still come pretty close to, still have some pretty respectable yields for sorghum. In Akron, this water production function here, most of the points that are making this water production function are dry land here. So the yield is variable, very variable among different years. Here, though, that water production function is actual applied deficit irrigations. This point here is actually dry land for the Greeley site. So this variability among years, though, is where we are interested in exploring and understanding a little bit more with the modeling what yields producers can expect in different years and in different climates. If we look a little closer at the water production functions at the Greeley site, we had on this graph, we had data from 2 years, from 2018 in black, where we had full ET at about 475 millimeters of water, and dry land at about 240 millimeters of water. In 2017, there's 2 different sets of data from 2017 because it dried down very quickly. And so in gray, we have the combine yields, but they're a little lower because we had a lot of yield loss because the grain was so dry. This is our hand harvest data. So if we look at the average, we still have a water production function that's falling along the same lines if we look at the average between those two. Interestingly enough, the high point, our maximum water treatment, our full ET treatment, appear to be a little low, and that was something that was seen in Akron as well. And both in the Akron site and for the Greeley site, it suggests to us that there was perhaps an insufficient nitrogen there for the sorghum to use that full water that it was supplied. So that's something that we are looking forward to having more data, another year's worth of data. Interestingly, we did have another year of data in 2019. So in 2019, though, although we had a full season of sorghum, 2019 was a really difficult year for sorghum across the region. It's something that perhaps some of you all remember, but even sites that reliably grow sorghum, at least in Nebraska, had issues. So it was a very cool, wet spring. And we were, with the short season variety that we were growing in Greeley, we thought that we might actually be okay, at least with our full water treatment in 2019. It turned out that although we did get some heads on the sorghum, we still ended up with near zero yield for sorghum across all the treatments, even the fully watered. So that is where, although we would like to see more years of sorghum data, we're also very keenly interested to develop some tools by which we can, so that a farmer would be able to predict, if the season is going to be so cool and wet going into the season, maybe this isn't a year that I want to put sorghum out. So with that segue, I'm going to stop sharing these slides and let Kyle take it from here.
All right, thanks, Louise. And thanks, Wilma, for setting all this up. Kyle, while we're changing presenters, I'm Kyle Douglas-Mankin. I've been with ARS for, let's see if I can get this. I can't do two things at one time. Get caught up in the slides here. Yeah, so I'm an agricultural engineer, been with ARS for a couple of years now. And before that, I was with hydrologist with USGS and with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And before that was with Kansas State University as a faculty member for a lot of years. And a lot of what I've done over the years is modeling, particularly watershed modeling. And as I use watershed models, you know, it's really clear that you don't get good results from a hydrologic standpoint unless you get the rainfall right, unless you get the crop right. Those are the two big parts of the hydrologic cycle, right? And so you can't expect everything else, soil moisture, stream flow, you can't expect all the rest of that stuff to come out well unless you've got the right rainfall and the right evaporation. So that ties into the crop part. And so when I came here, Louise and I and others in our unit were looking to explore ways to improve the modeling of crops in general for decision support tools and for watershed models, for just to help with a variety of things that that it would be helpful for us to have a predictive tool. Person I came soon after I got here, person retired, Greg McMaster, who was an agronomist. Like I say, I'm an agricultural engineer, but I'm kind of picked up where he left off. I was really excited and interested to see this tool that he was developing called Physiology MMS. And I don't know if any of you have heard of this tool, but it's a tool that predicts detailed crop phenology using pretty simple algorithms. It's available on the website that I show on the screen there. Hopefully you're all seeing the screen that I'm sharing. Let someone say no if they're not.
You're good.
Okay, it's good.
Yeah, good. And it's a tool that is used to count the number of growing degree days between phenological growth stages. And then let you know when the crop's going to be reaching these important milestones throughout its growth. So, everyone look on your screen, you can see where you have the take off the mute button. I want to ask you a question. How do any of you use phenological information in your practices? How do you use phenological information? Why would it be important to know the crop phenology? Like I say, I come from outside this area, so I'm kind of interested to see how you would or will have used crop phenology.
So I'd say the harvest interval would be a key there.
So tell me a little bit more. When you say harvest interval, what's that mean?
So some chemicals, insecticide would be, if you look at like a wire insecticide, there would be a time between when you apply and when you can go back and harvest so that the crop residue is low enough, the residues of the chemical on the crop are low enough that it's legal to harvest.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks, Todd. Anyone else? How else would you use phenology? You can tell I'm a professor because I'm very patient at waiting for a response from the class. Anyone have anything? Wait just a few more seconds here.
Yes, from a research point of view, we might use phenology to determine areas of best adaptability of different species and or different varieties within a species in different parts of eastern Colorado.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And that's a really important point, because these phenological stages, it's not just, you know, one set of phenological stages for sorghum. Sorghum has different varieties with, you know, early, medium, and late varieties with, you know, that take different times to progress through the growth stages. In addition to that, water stress can also influence how fast a crop moves through its growth stages. And I think that's one of the genius things that Greg McMaster put into Phenology MMS. And so on the bottom of the screen here, you see for sorghum and sunflower, since I'm going to show up in a couple other slides with sunflower in it later, you can see the top row is the non-stressed, the GN parameters, and the bottom row is the water stressed GS parameters. And you can see the numbers, I don't know if you can see that small, but the numbers in those relate to how many days, growing degree days, it takes to move from one stage to the other. So for example, if you look down here at sorghum, in the stressed condition, the GS, these numbers here, they say 97, and then in the non-stress, it says 80. So it actually takes longer for the stress crop to move from elongation to first bloom to half bloom than it does if it's not stressed. So it works through those phenological stages a bit quicker if it's not stressed. But then look here later in the growing season, after full bloom, both these numbers here for the non-stressed are longer. So to work through those phenological stages, it actually slows down relative to the stress, which speeds up its phenological development under water stress conditions. So, you know, it's not just a matter of, you know, under water stress, it slows down or speeds up. It goes both ways depending on the phenological stage. And Greg was trying to capture that with this Phenology MMS software, at least for non-stress and stress conditions. Put that together. So anyway, I guess the next question is, so is a crop in stressed or non-stressed conditions? And the answer is, well, it depends on the day, right? Right after irrigation, you're going to be non-stressed. And then as the water dries out, as Neil found out, you know, in the previous presentation, if you have classes and you can't get back and look at your sensor, you're going to go way into the stressed realm. So where are you day by day in the stressed realm versus non-stressed? Phenology MMS couldn't capture those differences because it didn't look at the soil and wasn't able to know what the soil moisture was. So we combined Phenology MMS with another model called AGIS, which is a watershed model, which does provide daily soil water. And so then we can figure out where we are on this graph on the right. Where are we between the non-stress condition and the stress condition? On the bottom, you see the water stress factor from 1 to 0, from no stress to full stress. And this is basically field capacity to wilting point, 100% of available water, 0%. And as you get down to about 80% of just available water, and this is on a water volume, in this case, you can do this anyway. You could do this a number of ways, but for this particular exercise, we're doing it on a volumetric water content. So you get down to 80% volumetric water in that of the available water, and you start changing the stress factor, the GN, the number of growing degree days it takes to go from one stage to the other until you get down to this GS. And these two graphs here represent, the top one represents what happens when the water stress speeds up the development, so it takes fewer days to go from one growth stage to the other. The GN parameter would be a larger number, the GS parameter would be a smaller number, and each day we check where the soil water is and figure out where we are between the GN and the GS parameter, and then tally up the number of growing degree days based on that stress factor. It can happen the other way too, where the stress factor is delayed. It's a bigger number, takes more growing degree days to go between stages. And so, basically it becomes a pretty complex calculation. Each day we have to figure out where the soil moisture is and figure out for that day, how is it accumulating growing degree days, and how do we add that to what it was doing the previous day? And it ends up being a pretty complex process for how simple it sounds at first. So this we call the unified plant growth model. And we call it the unified plant growth model because it took a pretty well accepted plant growth model called EPIC and added the phenology to it, added the soil water stress response. And it's supposed to be able to, you could take this UpGen model and slot it in wherever a model used the EPIC plant growth model and improve its performance, because now you're actually growing the crop phenologically. So you're better able to account for where the plant is and how it's allocating resources in each phenological stage. So a little bit of some early results from the testing. I've got a few graphs of sorghum on the top, a few graphs of sunflower on the bottom. And as I didn't mention, but I showed in the former slide, we are currently developing this model for 11 different crops. And so a number of different situations. We hope maybe be able to expand it to more, but right now we're just trying to make sure that this whole process works just for these 11. So here's sorghum and sunflower. Observed days here and simulated days here from a number of different experiments around Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska. And so a lot of data points for sorghum, not very many data points for sunflower that we were able to find data to compare to. And this one is just looking at where we've collected the days to emergence. And so the model's doing a really nice job of emerging the crop, that floral initiation, a little more variability, but boy, that's still a great match in general between the observed and the simulated. By the time you get to anthesis, we've kind of got a little bit of a drift and we're over predicting the number of days for sorghum, or under predicting the number of days for sunflower. So this is where you really need to get into, now that you have some data, let's look at those parameters that we're setting and do some fine tuning. And that's the stage we're at right now, is doing that fine tuning. Those were the phenological stages. Ultimately, you'd like to be able to predict other things related to the crop. So as it's growing along phenologically, or accumulating carbon through photosynthesis, you're allocating that carbon to different plant parts differently depending on the plant growth stage. And in the end, you'd like to be able to match up with crop yield and other parameters that are important, like say crop height. So here's a comparison of 3 different models that all start with the EPIC plant growth model. And then this is another wind erosion prediction system that does some tweaks to the EPIC model for its purposes, and then the UpGen, which we've been talking about. And you can see that the original EPIC model, by the observed final canopy height at the end of the season, and this is winter wheat. This is a different crop where we have data from Greeley and from Drake Farm, which is a farm near Alt, for different years. And so all these points here are data from those different fields. And the variability is because we took several measurements in the field, and different plants had different heights and different yields and so forth. So there's some variability in those data. If a point falls on this line, then the observed matches the simulated data, so you're doing really well. In this case, this original EPIC model didn't really grow the crop. It forced it to grow a certain way and reach a certain height. And so every plant reached that height regardless of water stress or anything. These two models both incorporate some version of UpGem, which does have the water stress factor, and you can see that they are responsive, but they're not quite hitting that line just yet. And that's just on us to kind of to adjust some of the parameters to get them to working. But the important thing for us is that we see it is responding to soil moisture in the same way that the crop would. Same thing on yield. We do get this nice response. And so it was really a good sign that we're seeing that the crop we are growing the crop correctly. We just have to adjust some of the rates of changes of things. And as I show here, the blue dots are the wetter or fully irrigated treatments. And then these are dry land treatments without irrigation. So you do get a pretty good range of water contents and yields. This is back to sunflower again. And this is a little bit more detailed assessment of the phenology using data from the LERF site that Louise was talking about earlier. And the lines here are the simulated for full irrigation and for no irrigation treatments in 2009. And these are the data points. And so, in general, we see that our model is within the variability of the data that we're seeing. So that's really good. And we'd like to do a little bit better job of, it looks like the no irrigation treatment is a little bit, advances a little faster. So it speeds up its development because of no irrigation, which we weren't capturing in the model. But then it slows down its development relative to full irrigation as it goes from vegetative to reproductive stages. And so it kind of slows down. So we're not quite capturing that, but then it kind of comes out in the wash later in the season. And so by the end of the season, we're following the line pretty nicely. And I don't know, so like I say, I've only been here a couple of years. 2009, what was that year like? From this data, was it a wet year, dry year, about average? Anyone remember?
I think it was about average.
About average. This would seem to indicate either that a model isn't as sensitive as it should be to water stress, or that even under no irrigation, the crop really wasn't getting too stressed out. It wasn't, so going back to those lines here, it wasn't getting too far down here towards the GS value, right? So even without irrigation, if you're still up here in the higher end of the relative available water, you're not going to be doing too much of that stress slow down. So so now we have a model that, it's starting to work reasonably well. We maybe got a little ahead of ourselves because we'd still like to come down and make it work a little bit cleaner, but we thought, well, we're getting ready to do a sorghum study out at LERF, and let's take a look. Let's see if we can use this model to do, something else besides what you all mentioned in the beginning for using phenological data. We said, based on our modeled understanding of how the crop progresses through phenology, how long it's going to take to get to harvest or harvest ready, maturity, using historical data, let's run that historical precipitation data with the site conditions, and let's see how many years we can reach maturity in time before the first frost with different planting dates. And so this is an example of something, that you can use the model to do that ends up being pretty useful. So based on the historical data from 92 to 2019, only 1 year wasn't able to reach maturity if we planted on May 1st, according to the model. So 96% of the time will pretty low risk of not reaching maturity. For the fully irrigated, we stay at that pretty low risk, for the first couple weeks, whereas the dry land drops off and, really starts to increase the risk of not reaching a full crop pretty quickly as the planting date goes on, to the point that if you wait even 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you're down to pretty close to about a 50-50 chance that you're not going to have a crop. And so, whereas if in the irrigated condition, you only, you lose maybe six years out of 28, even after the first couple, 2-3 weeks. So this is a pretty neat application of that phenological model. Helped us with our planning as we were thinking about when we needed to get, how much flexibility did we have for planting the sorghum relative to everything else we had going on out the farm, how much flexibility we had. And this kind of told us that at least for dryland, we didn't have a lot of flexibility for this particular variety. It may also indicate that we need to go to an earlier, more quickly maturing variety than what we were using. So again, not to get ahead of ourselves here, because right now we're really just trying to get the phenological stages matched up and how responsive they are to soil moisture. But we also just, let's take a look at the yields that we observed in 2017 and 18 for, and this is for sorghum still. But our model was the yields were actually a little lower than was projected by the model. 11% for 2018, 34% for 2017. And so the yields were a little lower than we were projecting. So we need to do some tweaking. But the promising thing looking at this is that it is following, again, it's following that trend. The model's responding in the proper direction with the proper kind of rate, but we just need to tweak the magnitude. And that's done by adjusting those parameters. For dry land, again, this is just like a single data point, so it's hard to go too many conclusions from this, but the dry land had more yield than we simulated for the crop. So we simulated the crop as being a bit more sensitive to water stress than it actually was in this. So our objectives going forward, and then we'll time for questions, any thoughts you all have. We do need to do some more calibration with the phenological parameters to make sure that it's working. And we've been collecting data we've got data from about 18 different sites around the Great Plains that have phenological data that we're going to be comparing for each of the 11 crops for multiple years and multiple locations around. So really give it a pretty robust test to make sure that it's capturing the phenological variability we see in varieties and such. And then we'll test it again for sorghum maturity probabilities and see if we can do a little better job, particularly of matching those yields. The yields we'd like to do a little better with that. And then apply it to other sorghum and other crops as we develop the modeling tool, and maybe help us understand something about this risk of reaching maturity across the region. And then getting back to the question that Louise has been talking about, which is these farm scale trade-offs of crop selection and irrigation scheduling that we really need to assess in this kind of tricky dry land, partly irrigated part of the world, where we're always operating on such a margin with these crops. And so using this modeling tool to help us get a better understanding of what that trade-off is, how much flexibility do we have? Should we be fully irrigating some crops and not irrigating others, or trying to deficit irrigate more of the crops? How do we use the limited water we have? Louise, do you have any follow-up on that?
I think that's, thank you, Kyle. That's, I think for us, at least I see it as a really exciting opportunity to not just look at one crop, but do some farm scale optimization. I think that will allow more flexibility for more people. But with that, I think we're also very keen to hear your opinions and ideas for how you might use some of these tools as well.
And this is a bigger team of folks besides Louise and myself who've been involved in various stages of collecting the field data and the modeling. So really great group of folks to work with.
Have you done any work with forage sorghum?
That could be another application. There's several forage crops that we're very keenly interested in. There's a forage millet that could be potential. So several of the 11 crops that that Kyle had on the list. It could also be very interesting to take a look at this tool. Could also, even if you had started, for example, planting sorghum, if you realized early on that this was not going to be a year that you were going to be getting grain from it, you might be able then within the season to switch tracks a bit and harvest it for forage, perhaps instead. So that's yet maybe another way that you could use the tool. We are keen to get as much data as possible for forage varieties in addition to grain varieties.
And I just flipped up the screen to show the various crops that we're currently focused on.
Yeah, the screen that you're currently on, as I understand it, water deficit caused the vegetative growth to slow down, but the reproductive growth to speed up. Are you seeing that in most of the crops?
No, it's not, that's not uniform. Both of these crops, sunflower and sorghum, you see that in the early vegetative stages, we're at least our starting point is no difference between the stressed and non-stressed, and then how it plays out from there really varies by crop. And in this case, these early stages are still all shorter. I mean, pretty much all of the stages are shorter on the stress condition versus the non-stressed, whereas sorghum does this little flip-flop from the vegetative to reproductive. So it really is, it varies by crop.
Okay, thank you.
There is a comment on the chat about if ET was applied water on the Greeley farm, when you have that graph comparing Garden City, Akron, and Greeley.
So in Greeley, ET is both precipitation and it's basically all forms of water that the crop can see. So it's both irrigation as well as precipitation. So that is something, both the Akron, I'm not familiar with the Garden City site, but both the Akron site and the Greeley site, there's really good water accounting. So both from Neutron Pro, but also from IRTs, from looking at the canopy temperatures, the crop water use is monitored through the season with very precise accounting.